Hello and welcome back to Litcast. In this episode we're going to be diving in a bit more detail to Act 1 of An Inspector Calls by J.B. Priestley. Let's get into it. Alright, Act 1 is the first of 3 acts in An Inspector Calls, and we open this play with the dining room of a fairly large suburban house in Brumley, and we see the family. Now, there are some stagings of this play that place the family almost in like a doll's house, or set up the staging so that you're peering into the window. The idea being that it's an exclusive occasion and that they are quite an exclusive and exclusionary family that really sort of heightens the idea of their capitalist intentions and ideals. So as the play opens, we see that there is a family dinner, and there's lots of description in those opening stage directions about this, and lots of lovely character descriptions as well. So we see Sheila and Gerald, and it's sort of the end of this dinner that celebrates their engagement. We meet Sheila's father, Arthur Burling, who's a wealthy factory owner, her mother Sybil and her brother Eric, and then we meet Gerald as well, and he is the son of Burling's business rival, Sir George Croft. And this is really important because the way that Burling talks about the engagement, it implies it's like some sort of business agreement, rather than it being an emotional or romantic arrangement. So Gerald presents Sheila with this beautiful engagement ring, and Mr. Burling proposes then a toast to the couple and talks about the future based on his experiences. And considering it's meant to be about his daughter and her future husband, it is quite an egocentric speech, which forms the theme of the way that he talks throughout most of Act 1. He talks about himself being a hard-headed, practical man of business, and he predicts a time of peace and prosperity for all capitalists like himself. Now then, after the speeches, Mrs. Burling, Sheila and Eric withdraw to another room, quite common for the time, and that leaves Mr. Burling and Gerald to enjoy another glass of port, which is mentioned in the opening stage directions. Gerald gives Sheila this engagement ring, this symbol of love and trust, and this is really key in this kind of opening little moment, because later on she will return the ring, so that symbol is important about their relationship. There's a lot of dramatic irony even at this early stage in the play, and the certainty of Burling's ideas sound ludicrous to an audience who has lived through the subsequent years beyond 1912, which is when the play is set. They've lived through 2 world wars, the collapse of the class system, the introduction of the welfare state, and all of these things. So Burling sounds ridiculous. And Burling also ridicules in his speeches here the ideas of writers with socialist sympathies, such as George Bernard Shaw and H.G. Wells. These are writers that J.B. Priestley really admired, and that kind of shows you the reaction that he wants you to have towards Mr. Burling, because Mr. Burling thinks the complete opposite to him. We'll talk a little bit more about the writers in another episode, and kind of go into a bit more detail about why they're particularly significant. So then we've got Burling and Gerald in the room alone with the port. So Mr. Burling privately here tries to impress Gerald with news of his forthcoming knighthood. He really hopes that this might please Gerald's parents, in particular Gerald's mother, Lady Croft. He feels, and we mentioned this in the synopsis, that she may disapprove of Gerald's engagement to Sheila. Class was very important in these days, and marriage was a way of, either maintaining the classes or, in some cases, perhaps social climbing. And social climbing was kind of frowned upon or seen. It wasn't necessarily frowned upon as such, but it was kind of seen as or looked down upon, I suppose, a little bit. Eric then returns and helps himself to another drink. And Mr. Burling then offers the young men some advice about life. He starts discussing a person's responsibility to look after himself and his own. And he makes lots and lots of ludicrous statements and kind of goes on and on and on to the point where you need something to interrupt him. When he talks about the Titanic being unsinkable, he talks about people being bees in a hive and how we're all expected to look after each other, and that's ridiculous. He goes on. And then the doorbell rings and the arrival of the inspector is announced. So, in this little moment, Burling and Gerald enjoying that port and a smoke show that sense of indulgence, and the fact that they're very used to that. It's part of the routine. It wasn't sort of made out to be a big special moment. Everyone just naturally moved to the different rooms. They naturally moved to get themselves a drink. So it's something that they're quite used to. Burling jokes the family need to behave ourselves, don't get into a police court or start a scandal, and this happens sort of very, very close to that doorbell ringing. The reason why he says that is he says that the knighthood is pretty much his, but he just needs to make sure that there's no scandal, so he can secure it. His complacency here is really important. So he's not saying this in a genuine way. He's kind of laughing about it, because he doesn't think in a million years that his family will be involved in a scandal. And he has no idea what is about to be revealed in terms of the relationship to Eva Smith and the chain of events that happens. This is called proleptic irony. It's a particular type of irony, and this is where a character says something that turns out to be wrong or much more significant than he or she thought at the time. It's not essential that you call it proleptic irony. It is certainly dramatic irony, you can call it that, or just ironic statements. But, if you fancy adding to your irony repertoire, then there it is, proleptic irony. While Burling and Gerald laugh together, Eric re-enters and he's helping himself to port. And we learn later that Eric has a secret drink problem. When you see this in performance, it's clear quite early on that he is uncomfortable in the family situation and seems to be reliant on his drink. And this is how this is kind of an example which you see across many different characters of how Priestley builds the idea of this hidden secrets and little things that will come out later into the play. And again, when you see it in performance, whether you watch a filmed version or a theatrical version, the way that the performances are developed, the way the actors develop their physical performance and non-verbal performance often gives you hints about these secrets too. Burling's hypocritical views about personal responsibility. So he says things like, a man has to make his own way, has to look after himself. They're really important because those views are really inappropriate for a former Lord Mayor and future knight, since both positions are associated with service to the community. So this idea of looking after yourself and no one else is at odds with the position he's trying to gain and the positions he's had before. Then everything changes. Edna, the parlour maid, who is not really in this hugely, but is still a significant character, Edna enters and says, "Please, sir, an inspector's called." So she announces the arrival of the inspector, and Mr. Burling assumes that this is because he's a magistrate, and this visit is something to do with him being consulted or getting advice in some way. Gerald jokes that Eric might have been up to something, where they're kind of joking, Gerald and Mr. Burling. That's then contrasted by Eric's uneasiness. So again, we're getting that sense that there's some sort of guilt, there's some sort of guilty secret. Inspector Gall then enters and begins his inquiries because a young woman has drunk disinfectant, and he says burnt her inside out. It's graphic, it's visceral, it's very unpleasant. And he talks about this young woman's suicide, describing her agonising death, and he says it in graphic detail. He pulls no punches. He names the victim as Eva Smith, and he mentions that she left a diary, a letter, and that was all left at her lodgings with a photograph. Then he shows this photograph to Burling to jog his memory, but he refuses to allow the other men to see it. This is key. He only shows one person the photograph at a time, saying one person and one line of inquiry at a time. So, the first words spoken by the inspector are, "I'm on duty." He refuses Burling's invitation to have a drink, which is what Burling kind of offers as he comes in. This is significant because duty and responsibility, that same kind of idea, are concepts that we need to heavily associate with the inspector, and also they're concepts that Priestley really wants to have foregrounded in the play. Burling also then boasts of his high position in Brumley and his former titles of Alderman and Lord Mayor, but the inspector seems unimpressed. And this is usually quite a comic moment in performance as well, where Mr. Burling is trying to sort of not so much show off, but very much assert himself in front of the inspector. And the inspector very clearly is not humouring him, is not taking any interest, and he just wants to get on with his job. He's more concerned with an individual's conscience than he is with status. So more concerned with how you are as a person rather than what you are as a person. The inspector uses shock tactics as well. So we talked about that graphic, visceral detail he uses to describe Eva Smith's death. And the aim is there to evoke some emotion, to prick the conscience of his for want of a better word, suspects, and make the audience imagine her suffering. So just a couple of things. An alderman, which I mentioned, is a senior member of a town council, right? So again, a position of political authority and a position of high status. And a magistrate is again someone who acts as a judge in a magistrate's court. That's quite significant because that kind of person is meant to be moral, good, lawful. So again, quite important foregrounding here. And the visceral imagery doesn't necessarily have the intended effect on Mr. Burling, as the dismissal of his status doesn't necessarily seem to stop Mr. Burling in his tracks from the inspector too. So those two are very much at odds. Then Mr. Burling is interrogated. So Burling admits, looking at the picture, that he recognises Eva Smith, and he's quite dismissive about it, but he does recognise her. The inspector then scrutinises Burling's actions as an employer. So he questions Burling about Eva Smith, and Burling admits that he sacked Eva from the factory because she played a significant part in a strike about pay and conditions. Despite hearing those disturbing details about her suicide, that visceral imagery, Burling maintains he's done nothing wrong. At no point does he ever stop and think that he could have done something different. That's again significant and shows the on sort of the continuum of people likely to change and people who are fixed in their views, and the capitalist versus socialist argument. He is right at the capitalist end, and it's going to take an awful lot for him to change. Burling is really complacent about his refusal to increase workers' wages to, I think it's 25 shillings a week. And then he's a bit insulted when the inspector asks why, because people don't usually question his actions or his decisions. Gerald supports the sacking of Eva Smith, whereas Eric describes it as tough luck. He doesn't necessarily agree with it, but also he doesn't feel, he's not completely distraught by it. Burling justifies his actions, and this is where he says that if you don't sort of if you don't stop these people, if you don't come down sharply on some of these people, they'll soon be asking for the earth. That's it. And this shows that idea of class division, that these people are maybe almost sort of biologically less than him because they're of a lower class, which is ironic considering that he is arguably of a lower class than his wife. The inspector's lack of admiration and deference towards Burling is irritating to him. And like I said, this is usually quite a comedic moment in performance. So Burling tries to then intimidate Inspector Goole. He asks him to repeat his name as though he's going to sort of check up on him. And then he refers to the Chief Constable as a friend of his, and he expects the inspector to sort of take a step back and check himself a bit, and the inspector doesn't. He does not buy into this. He is unshaken, and the idea of rank, superiority, respect, all of this is repeated throughout the play, and we consider what we're meant to respect. Are we meant to respect a person's morals or a person's status? And Burling tries to shift the focus away from his own involvement with Eva's suicide to ask about what happens next. And he asks lots and lots of questions to almost deflect off him. And we see that later on with Mrs. Burling as well. She tries to deflect blame from herself and ends up digging herself a big hole. So Burling's use of euphemism here. Euphemism is it's like words used in place of something that might be considered offensive or indelicate. So here we've got the idea of euphemism, and all of these questions. This shows that he's got a complete lack of concern for Eva Smith. He doesn't care what's happened to her now. And this selfishness is really clear to see, and again carries on throughout the play. And what he's euphemizing in this section here is the fact that she potentially became a prostitute. So he says that she went out on the streets, and this idea of prostitution, or the euphemism of prostitution, comes up several times in the play from different characters. And things like try something else with other ideas, women of the town. Lots of characters talk about this. So, Mr. Burling has been through this process of interrogation. Now we've got the interrogation of Sheila. Sheila comes into the room, and she's happy. This is her engagement party. And despite Burling's best efforts to protect her, she is then the subject of the inspector's scrutiny. So Sheila hears the story of Eva Smith's suicide, and the inspector again holds nothing back. He's visceral in his language. He says that she died after several hours of agony, and Sheila here is genuinely distressed. She's really upset by this. Sheila comes across as quite young and quite childish and naive at the start of the play, and as she progresses through the play, she becomes she seems to develop a maturity. So she acknowledges her involvement in the events that led up to Eva's death, and she looks at the photograph that the inspector has, and it sends her sobbing from the room. So that emotional response again shows that there is a sense of guilt here. She demonstrates this generational divide, the younger and the older people in the play, because she takes responsibility and feels guilty. Burling's really angry because at this point Sheila's really upset, and he feels the inspector has ruined their celebration. And this again highlights his indifference towards the dead girl, because there's more here, more emotion about him ruining the engagement party than the fact that this girl that they could be partly responsible for has died. Priestley deliberately uses this juxtaposition here to contrast the really comfortable lives of the Burlings with then the harsh suffering of Eva Smith, and that kind of emphasizes the social divide. So there's a key quote that's really good to sort of unpick, which is a nice little promising life there, I thought, and a nasty mess someone's made of it. So that again there's a strong contrast, and he likes to use that contrast for shock effect and to really highlight the class divides, the social divides, and the dividing attitude as well. And then we've got the very last bit of Act 1, because I know this has been a mammoth episode. This is where Sheila starts to take on a different role in the play. So Burling goes to tell Mrs. Burling what's happening, because remember, she's still in the other room. The inspector refuses to allow Eric and Gerald to see the photograph. Sheila returns. She lets everyone know what's going on. So before this in the play, we've seen the photograph, and we know that Sheila is involved in some way. There's been some mention of where Eva Smith went next after the factory, but Sheila then comes back and sort of fills us in on the details as to exactly what happened. So she got Eva sacked from Millwards because Eva, she says, smiled behind her back as she tried on a garment that didn't suit her. So she was really keen to try on this garment, didn't suit her, but then she confesses that basically she thought that Eva would look better in the garment. She felt Eva was prettier than her, and that jealousy drove her to sack or to get the manager to sack Eva Smith. So she went to the manager and said that this girl had been very impertinent, and the key thing here is that Sheila recognises that was the wrong thing to do, and she takes responsibility for it. She feels remorse for what she did. Obviously, that doesn't fix the situation, but it's a clear difference in attitude from Mr. Burling. So then the inspector mentions that Eva Smith changed her name to Daisy Renton, and this very clearly startles Gerald. Again, there's stage directions for that. When Eric takes the inspector out of the room, Sheila, who noticed this, tries to make Gerald confess that he knew Daisy and was seeing her the previous summer, because right at the start, when they're having their engagement party, Daisy mentions that there was a summer that Gerald never went near her. So the inspector already mentioned this sort of chain of events leading to Eva's suicide, and that means that Gerald's sort of admission that he knew Daisy as this extra link in the chain. And there's tension because the characters begin to realise the extent of the inspector's knowledge, not only about Eva Smith / Daisy Renton, but of the family's involvement in her life. And Sheila warns Gerald against trying to keep facts hidden or trying to outsmart the inspector. So one of the last lines is, "Why, you fool, he knows. Of course he knows." So at the end of that is the end of the act. And that's the end of Act 1. Lots of drama, lots of change. So tune in to our next episode and we will talk all about Act 2 in lots more detail. Thank you very much for listening, and we'll see you in the next one. Thank you for listening to Litcast, the podcast for GCSE and A-level revision. The music that you hear in this episode is called Galaxy and was written by Ixon, and you can find the rest of his music on SoundCloud. You can also find us on other social media channels, including YouTube, where you'll also find our Litcast live episodes. Thank you so much for listening, and we hope to see you again.